So Anne, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. And one of the things I know we want to talk about is what you referred to as a single paradigm. So that's certainly something we'll talk about in a bit. However, before we get there, let's just find out a bit about you and how you got to become a Three Principles educator.
Well, I started training about 3.5 years ago, having come through massive burnout in the work that I used to do. And the evidence of the change in my life, the experiences that I've had since then within the principles has been totally transformative. And so where am I now? I'm still fascinated with the principles, still learning because we never stop learning. So I would say I'm a lifelong student of the principles. Thank God we're never going to get to the end of it. We're never going to know it all. So actually that keeps me very humble, Liz. And it keeps me very quiet in myself and loving life, loving the people that I work with. And I'm learning that of all the relationships in the world, because of course you know, we're in relationship to the world around us, to the weather, to our colleagues, to our family, to our animals. But the primary relationship is with my own thinking. The primary relationship for me is my relationship to myself. So I'm learning to listen a lot more to my own thoughts, my own thinking. And that's been doing something for me. It does something for me in as much as my mind quiets. I become more peaceful. And out of that is born a lovingness, not only for me and my failures, my perceived failures, and my perceived judgments, for me. When that begins to soften and eventually dissolve, what's left is love. So from that place of lovingness, I look out on a world that's become loving for me. So that's a beautiful thing for anybody to experience. So my focus now is on a single paradigm principles where nothing is split. So for example, the way that I used to share the principles 2-3 years ago has completely changed, in as much as it's not so full of stories anymore. It's not as long-winded as it used to be. It's not as full of metaphor as it used to be. So out of that has been born a simplicity of, it's almost black and white, which I would never have believed was possible within the principles, because for me it's always been rather fluffy and rather, I would say that I've been living in a meditative state for really long periods of time, living in a blissed out state of living in a beautiful feeling. But when I came across the paradigm, a most remarkable thing happened. It was as if I grounded into my body an embodiment of the understanding through the single paradigm.
So I'm going to pause you there because I do want to understand that more fully. And I guess for people that don't know your background, you've come from the world of EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique. And I'd be really curious if you could describe, I guess, the main or the key difference for you in both these fields, because both fields are there to support and help and are caring. There's nothing to say that is the case. So what's the difference for you? What had you move and shift to the Three Principles?
Well, given that I'd been self-employed for nearly 15 years and been traveling all over the world teaching trauma techniques, because as you know, I was something of a worldwide expert working in trauma. But that entailed that I actually went to people's history, to the moment that the trauma happened. And I would engage people in their senses. So for example, if it was a car accident and somebody had died, if somebody out of that scenario came to see me, I would be looking at the smell of blood, the sound of screaming, lights in somebody's eyes, the shock of it, because there was an idea at that time that shock retained in the body could create illness. There's been a lot of research that chronic long-term stress creates illness. So I've always been very interested in that mind-body connection. But it entailed that I would go into the past day after day after day. And I loved doing it, Liz. I loved watching little miracles happen in front of me, watching people who were severely traumatized come out of it and go back to living their old lives. In fact, they would live their lives anew, with a totally new perspective, which is why for years my company's been called New Perspectives. When I was going back into people's past, I was inadvertently finding what was wrong. What was it that was wrong that would prevent them from leading wonderful, happy, fulfilled lives? And I would look to that and work with that. Now, I was also looking to what was wrong with me. So the more wrongness I looked for, the more wrongness I found. Because what I've learned in the principles now is that we're creating moment to moment to moment. So when one story was deleted, and it would be deleted permanently, another story would arise. So it was curious to me in the 15 years that I was working with people's stories that I never seemed to come to an end. And ultimately that was exhausting. So when I came into the principles, I saw this potential for noticing that what I was thinking wasn't important and that it wasn't the truth about my circumstances. It looks like it because it's real and it's compelling. If somebody punches me, for example, I'm going to feel that. It's going to be painful. I'm going to have a lot of thinking about that. So what I used to do was blame that person, make the system wrong, make their background wrong, make their parents wrong, make their schooling wrong. And I would do my very best to fix all of that. What's different for me in the principles now is when somebody punches me metaphorically or inadvertently, what I'm sitting with is the relationship to my own thinking. So then what happens is I might be upset, I might be angry, but I get over it much more quickly than I would have years ago. So what are the implications if I get over something like that much more quickly? Well, I'm trusting my thinking less and less. I'm not out to blame anybody. I've certainly lost a huge amount of judgment, like 90 to 95% of what's going on the outside of me. And again, the implication of that is I feel so peaceful. I feel so at ease. I don't feel other people's expectations on me or my own. That was the biggest thing. So to answer your question, the biggest difference for me is that I no longer have to look at the content of other people's stories and thinking. So I want to just qualify that, because that doesn't mean that I don't respect the story. It doesn't mean that I don't hear the story. And it doesn't mean that I'm not interested. But what I see is a light that switches on inside of people. And it's the light that I relate to. It's the light that really hears. It's the light that I speak to. And of course the stories are within. And as you know, as a principles facilitator, our tendency is not to commiserate. We love, but we don't get engaged in the story. Because once we get engaged in the story, it could be like any other coaching practice, any other coaching technique, or any other coaching process. So the biggest learning for me has been the lack of doing. Because I was an incredible doer. You know, whatever I did, I was doing all the time. So the biggest challenge has been to actually sit back and do nothing. Now, when I first heard that, I thought that was really weird. To be honest, how can miracles happen in front of you when you're with a client or with a group and you're not doing anything? But when I invite people to look for the feeling, to immerse themselves in the feeling, in the fundamental principles behind all life, the fundamental principles that are the building blocks to our moment-to-moment experience, something happens which I don't understand and which I can't explain. But people connect with that light within. And the truth is, they know it. And the more that I speak to that light within, the more it shines. And that's enough for me. So I don't have to fix my client anymore. I don't have to give my advice to clients anymore. I don't need to make suggestions. And I'm truly understanding on a deeper level that every client is creative, resourceful, and whole. And don't get me wrong, I've known that for many years, but I knew it on an intellectual level. Now it's a much deeper, more grounded understanding than I've ever experienced. And also, the less I do, the more space it gives my client for transformation.
And so, coming back then to the single paradigm.
Yes.
What is the single paradigm? It's probably a big question.
It is a big question. In fact, for me, it's almost been a 2-year conversation, because it is so completely upside down to everything I've ever learned. But the journey and the reward has been worth it. The single paradigm is an understanding that we can't split life at any level. So, you know, when we talk about quality of thinking, highs, lows, state of mind, it depends what state of mind you're in as to how you're going to perform. And that's true to a level. But when we release the need to talk about quality of thinking, to talk about state of mind, and we bring everything to a whole. So, for example, I would have split out the 3 principles and gone to quite some lengths to explain the difference between the 3 principles. Now I see the oneness of it. I see the continuity of something that's been around for thousands of years. Sydney Banks talked about this understanding already being in place before time. Now that gave me cause to believe and to know without a shadow of a doubt that this has always been going on. It's only that there's been an innocent misunderstanding in how we have worked with psychology. And the more that I see the innocence of that, the less I need to engage with it. So the single paradigm is seeing the oneness of everything. I'm simplifying it a lot,
Yes.
because I know we haven't got a lot of time. So it's seeing the oneness in everything. So if I was to make a comparison, for example, I used to work with a lot of pain. So for example, if somebody came with a painful shoulder.
Is this when you were with EFT?
Yes.
Yes.
I would engage with that pain, and we would find the color of the pain, on a scale 0 to 10, how strong the pain was, when it first started. And I would literally tap that away, or a client would tap that away. In the principles, we've already split it. It's already split, because if thought and feeling go together, how can I focus on pain when my thought has already gone to, oh, isn't that a pretty flower? So what I know about pain is when I'm not focused on it, it can't be that. So in the paradigmic work, we don't focus on what's wrong. Rather, we focus on the oneness within the principles. So that means I don't need to split the principles out, because it's all happening now, moment to moment anyway. The other way of recognizing a principles paradigmic teacher is when they begin to ask the question, where's your experience coming from? So that in itself is a paradigm. That in itself is a logical question to ask somebody who's very lost in their story. Because I've proved to myself over again that if I know where my thinking is coming from, it doesn't matter what kind of thought storm I'm in. As soon as I see, I know where my thinking is coming from. I don't need to give it a lot of attention. The feeling disappears and dissolves immediately. And the more you do that, the more I certainly live in a point of truth. And I have an experience of the point of truth. So as soon as I see the logic and the wisdom of the single paradigm, I'm immediately in the feeling. Whereas before, there may have been quite some conversation before a client got into the feeling. Now, as soon as they see how the mind works, they're there in the feeling, which is beautiful, because as you know, when the feeling is present, we can learn a lot more. So now it's much more black and white for me. Is, am I in the paradigm? Am I aligned with it? Or am I not? And to simplify it even further, is that any time I have a thought storm, I know that I'm not in alignment with truth. Now, that simplifies all the stories, the metaphors. My understanding has deepened and grounded phenomenally. And there are less and less stories, and I experience a quiet that is remarkable. But so are my clients, experiencing a state of quiet that's deeply profound and that is available to every human being on the planet, and always has been, and always will be. When I know and understand the truth of that, there really is nothing to do. So in that moment I can let go of any kind of control. I can let go of, and when I say letting go, I'm not meaning a doing, because if it becomes a doing, I might not want to let go.
Yeah.
So then it becomes a struggle. So it happens all on its own, which in my mind is the miracle, because I don't even need to do the doing of letting go. It just happens for me. That's awesome. That fills me with wonderment and awe that there is a power behind life that does the work for me. And all I have to do is look at the single paradigm. Now the interesting thing that comes out of that for me is that when I have a problem, it becomes a problem of my innocent misunderstanding of the paradigm. Now, I'm not even getting involved in the story. It's just a problem of innocent misunderstanding. Now, that's simple and powerful.
I was going to say, it just sounds as though you're really, I mean, this is probably not the right language in a way, but almost like letting yourself off the hook. It's so simple that you're, what I'm hearing here is that you're either aligned with the single paradigm, and my understanding of that is that spiritual sort of space that exists, or you're not. And
Yes.
and every problem that we conceive of in our heads is just an indication of where we're operating from at any 1 minute in time. Is that
Absolutely.
what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's moment to moment to moment.
Yeah.
And that's what's so momentous about this new paradigm in psychology. Once I'm aligned and I have the experience of that, I recognize it over and over and over.
And for me, it's something about the recognition.
Yes.
It's something about, you used the image of a light before, seeing the light in somebody.
Yes.
And for me, there's something about just noticing when I'm aligned or not, which is that feeling. I'm like, where am I? And it is a feeling.
Yes.
And actually, the more that you pay attention to that, the more you just get used to noticing if you're in or out of it. That's just my experience.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. And so, to simplify it even more, what it becomes is what we were talking about in the beginning, is having a relationship. My primary relationship is with my own thinking. So then it becomes the art of gentle introspection, is what I'm calling it now. So in this relationship that I have with my own thinking, it's looking to that. And then the outside falls away. And love is present. And we live and walk and work in the presence of love.
And I'm going to leave it there with this interview today, but it's just been an absolute delight, as always, to see you and to have a chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. It's been such a pleasure.